Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at the topic that I know a lot of you guys are thinking about and talking about and struggling with. It's how modern education, all this stuff about like feminist ideology and how that has shaped education, especially, its effects on boys. I know a lot of you are really interested in this whole red pill philosophy and really looking to understand how institutions have changed. And specifically, a lot of you are thinking about covert contracts within marriage and things like that. Well, this book that we're going to be looking at today dives headfirst into all this and doesn't shy away from asking some really tough questions like, has the education system become, and if so, how did that even happen? And what does that even mean for men today? Is there a bias against traditional masculinity in schools these days? And are boys being disadvantaged by the current system?
It's really important, I think, to approach these questions with historical context in mind. And that's what I think is so interesting about this book, is it doesn't just throw out opinion. It really lays out a solid foundation of historical analysis and uses research data. And it really helps you connect the dots and see the bigger picture of what's going on.
Okay, so let's break it down. You mentioned historical context, so let's rewind the clock a little bit. I mean, we all know about the classical approach to education with figures like Aristotle and Plato, championing objective truth and logic and all that.
Right. And that model really held sway for centuries, shaping Western thought and all of that. Things really started to shift during the Enlightenment period. Thinkers like John Locke advocating for education for everybody, not just the elite. And that opened the doors to a much greater emphasis on individual experience, which, in a lot of ways was very positive. But it also laid the groundwork for some of the changes that this book is critiquing.
Okay, so more people getting educated. That sounds like a good thing. But how did that lead to what this book describes as the feminization of education?
Well, the book argues that, as education became more accessible, there was a move away from that strict focus on logic and objective truth, and a move towards a more personalized, experience-based approach. And the progressive education movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, led by figures like John Dewey, really pushed this idea of experiential learning.
Experiential learning. Some of us might not be familiar with that term. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, it's about learning by doing, by actively engaging with the material rather than just passively absorbing information. It emphasizes personal growth, empathy, understanding through direct experience. Now, this approach has its benefits, but the book argues that it also began to tip the scales away from traditional masculine values and learning style.
And this shift coincided with the rise of the women's rights movement, which, was obviously a landmark moment for equality. But it also plays a key role in the book's analysis.
Exactly. The book isn't trying to demonize the women's rights movement or anything like that, but it does argue that this movement, while advocating for equality unintentionally, contributed to some changes in the education system that ultimately disadvantaged boys.
Okay, so more women in the system led to a system that somehow works against men.
So the book really delves into how, as more women entered the education system, both as teachers and as students, this system itself began to adapt. And the curriculum and the teaching methods started to cater more towards learning styles that are traditionally considered feminine. So think more emphasis on collaboration, emotional intelligence, empathy, and less on competition and just pure logic.
So you're saying it's not just about who's teaching, it's also about how they're teaching.
Precisely. And it goes beyond just teaching style. The book also points to the introduction of women's studies programs, which played a vital role in challenging traditional power structures and highlighting female perspectives. But the book argues that this, in some ways, unintentionally led to the marginalization of masculine viewpoints and a decline in traditional male role models in schools, especially male teachers.
Fewer and fewer Mr. Miyagi's to guide young minds.
Right, and particularly in elementary and secondary education. This lack of male representation can really impact boys who are looking for those positive male figures to emulate. And the book contends that this, along with other factors, has contributed to what it calls a boy crisis.
A boy crisis. Now you've got my attention. What does that mean?
The book uses this term to describe the trend of boys falling behind academics. It cites research data showing declining academic performance across almost all subjects, higher dropout rates, and increased disciplinary actions for boys compared to girls.
Wow. But is it really fair to say that schools are too feminine? And that's the sole reason for these issues?
Well, the book doesn't present it as a simple cause and effect situation. It acknowledges that there are many factors at play. But it does argue that suppressing natural male behaviors like rough play and competition in an effort to create a more inclusive environment might actually be detrimental to boys' development.
Yeah, I can see how that might be a problem. Like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. The book also dives into like the psychological effects of all this, right?
Absolutely. It talks about how constant negative messaging about masculinity can lead to boys feeling ashamed of who they are, developing low self-esteem, and lacking motivation in school. They're constantly being told that their natural instincts are somehow problematic, and that can be incredibly damaging.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it's not just theoretical. The book backs up these points with some pretty powerful real-life examples.
Oh, absolutely. One that really sticks with me is the story of Tommy, this bright, energetic boy who struggled in school because his learning style clashed with the more feminized teaching method. He was constantly being told to sit still, be quiet, and focus on tasks that didn't really engage him.
Oh, yeah. I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I was always the kid who needed to move around and learn by doing, not just by listening.
Right. And it highlights how a one-size-fits-all approach to education just doesn't work for every child, and how boys in particular might need different strategies to thrive.
And the book goes even deeper, using specific case studies to illustrate these points. It mentions a school that disciplined a 6-year-old boy for pretending his pencil was a ray gun, a pencil.
Yeah. And that example perfectly illustrates the book's point about this oversensitivity to anything remotely perceived as violent or aggressive, even in completely harmless contexts.
It's like we've become so afraid of even like the slightest hint of masculinity. We're stifling boys' natural expression.
And this fear, the book argues, is often driven by certain ideologies that have infiltrated the education system.
Okay, let's talk about that. The book delves into the role of ideology, specifically pointing to things like Marxism, critical theories, gender studies.
Right. It argues that these ideologies have kind of seeped into the curriculum and created a culture of victimhood in education, where men are often portrayed as oppressors and women as perpetual victims.
So basically, boys are being taught to feel guilty just for being boys.
That's one way to put it. And this guilt, according to the book, can have a profound impact on boys' self-esteem and their ability to navigate the world.
It's a tough pill to swallow. But the book doesn't just leave us with this bleak picture, right? There's more to come.
Absolutely. You know, we've laid the groundwork here understanding the historical shifts and the problems that the book identifies. But in the next part, we'll dive into some potential solutions and alternative approaches to education that the book explores.
Okay, sounds good. We'll be back in a moment to talk about those.
Looking forward to it.
All right, so we've explored some pretty heavy stuff. This whole historical shift and the boy crisis and the influence of ideology in education and everything. But I'm ready for some solutions. What does the book offer in terms of alternative approaches?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. You know, the book doesn't just critique the current system, it actually offers some pretty compelling alternatives. One model it highlights is the Finnish education system, which has gained a lot of international attention for its success.
Yeah. I've heard good things about Finland schools. What makes them so different?
Well, for starters, they have a strong emphasis on objective learning. Clear expectations and a structured environment. They focus on core subjects like math, science, and history, with less emphasis on emotional learning or subjective interpretation.
Interesting. So it's less about coddling students
Yeah.
and more about giving them a solid foundation of knowledge and skills.
Exactly. And the book argues that this kind of structure and clarity are actually really beneficial for boys, who often thrive in environments with clear rules, expectations, and, a focus on achieving tangible goals.
Okay, I'm starting to see the appeal here. But how do we bridge the gap between where we are now and this Finnish model? It feels like such a drastic shift.
Well, the book acknowledges that change won't happen overnight, but it advocates for a restoration of balance in education. It's not about erasing empathy or emotional intelligence altogether. It's about valuing those qualities alongside logic, reason, and a focus on objective truth.
Right, so it's not about swinging the pendulum all the way back in the other direction.
Yeah.
It's about finding that middle ground where all students can benefit.
Precisely. And one key area the book focuses on is reintroducing physical activity into the school day. Remember, we talked about how boys are naturally more physically active and how suppressing that energy can actually hinder their learning.
Yeah, it's like trying to make a cheetah do yoga. It just doesn't work.
Exactly. So the book suggests bringing back things like recess, robust physical education classes, and competitive sports. It argues that these activities not only provide an outlet for boys' energy, but also teach them valuable lessons about teamwork, discipline, and resilience.
Okay, that makes sense. Let boys be boys. But what about discipline? We can't just let them run wild, right?
Of course not. But the book does argue that traditional disciplinary methods like detention or even suspension when warranted can be more effective than some of the more emotionally sensitive approaches that are popular today.
So less talking about feelings and more about establishing clear consequences for action.
Right. It's about teaching boys responsibility and accountability, not just trying to understand their every emotion. It's about helping them develop self-control and understand that their actions have real-world consequences.
This is all starting to sound like a system that might actually work. But are there any real-world examples of this? Are there schools that are successfully implementing these alternative approaches?
Absolutely. The book highlights several schools that have made these changes and seen positive results. One example is an all-boys school in California that emphasizes physical activity, has a structured learning environment, and uses traditional disciplinary methods.
So they're not shying away from letting boys be boys.
Not at all. And their students are thriving. They're performing well academically, they're disciplined, they have high self-esteem, and they're developing a strong sense of camaraderie.
That's encouraging. Are there other examples?
Another one the book mentions is an all-boys school in Australia. That places a strong emphasis on physical activity and team sport. They also have a very structured curriculum and high expectations for their students.
So this isn't just a localized phenomenon. Schools in different parts of the world are seeing success with this approach.
Exactly. And the book points out that girls in these schools often benefit as well. They learn to be more assertive, resilient, and independent in an environment that values these qualities.
So it's not about excluding girls or putting them down. It's about finding a model that works for everyone by acknowledging that boys and girls might have different needs.
Precisely. It's about creating a learning environment where all students can reach their full potential regardless of gender. And that's something we should all be striving for.
Okay, so we've talked about alternative approaches and seen some positive examples, but I know there's more to this story. What other challenges does the book address?
Well, one of the biggest challenges the book tackles is this increasing rejection of objective truth in education. And it argues that this trend is particularly harmful to boys. We're often wired for, logical thinking and factual analysis.
So we've swung too far in the direction of everyone's truth is valid.
That's what the book suggests. It argues that overemphasizing personal experience and feelings can actually undermine critical thinking and the pursuit of knowledge.
And this ties into the whole safe spaces and trigger warnings debate, right? This idea that students need to be shielded from uncomfortable ideas.
Exactly. The book argues that this kind of coddling can actually do more harm than good, prevents students from developing resilience, critical thinking skills, and the ability to engage with diverse perspectives.
It's like we're raising a generation of snowflakes who melt at the slightest hint of disagreement.
Well, that might be a bit of an exaggeration, but the book does suggest that we're creating an environment where intellectual exploration and open debate are being stifled.
So how do we bring back objective truth to education? How do we encourage critical thinking without sacrificing empathy and sensitivity?
It's a complex question, but the book offers some potential solutions. First, it advocates for a reintroduction of traditional teaching methods that emphasize logic, reason, and critical thinking. It's about teaching students how to think, not just what to think.
So back to the basics, but with a modern twist.
Exactly. It's about teaching students how to analyze information, evaluate evidence, and construct logical arguments. It's about giving them the tools to think critically and independently, even about sensitive or controversial topics.
Okay, I like that. Give them the tools, then let them explore.
The book also emphasizes the importance of having clear academic standards and holding students accountable for their work.
So no more participation trophies for just showing up.
Right. It's about recognizing and rewarding excellence, not just effort. It's about instilling a sense of accomplishment and pride in achieving something meaningful.
Okay, that makes sense. Structure, high expectations, a focus on objective truth. It's starting to feel like a real plan. What else does the book suggest?
Finally, and this is crucial, the book argues that we need to expose students to a diversity of viewpoints, even those they might disagree with.
No more ideological echo chambers.
Exactly. It's about creating an environment where students can engage in respectful debate, learn to see things from different perspectives, and develop their own informed opinion.
Okay, I'm on board. Less victimhood, more personal responsibility, more critical thinking, more open dialogue. That sounds like a world I want to live in.
Me too. But the book doesn't stop there. It also delves into the impact of this victimhood culture we've been talking about. And it's not just about the impact on boys, it looks at the broader societal effects.
That's interesting. So this isn't just a men's issue. It affects everyone.
That's the book's contention. It argues that this constant focus on victimhood can be detrimental to everyone, can lead to a sense of entitlement, a lack of personal responsibility, and a tendency to blame others for one's problems.
And this isn't just a theoretical concern, right? The book uses real-world examples to illustrate this point.
Absolutely. It points to things like the increase in lawsuits, the rise of cancel culture, and the polarization of political discourse as evidence of this victimhood mentality at play.
Yeah, I can see how that could be problematic. It's like we're so focused on who's been wronged that we've lost sight of finding solutions or taking responsibility for our own actions.
Exact. The book argues that we need to move away from this culture of victimhood and towards a culture of personal responsibility, resilience, and accountability.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
How do we actually shift a culture that's become so ingrained?
It's a complex challenge, but the book offers some thought-provoking ideas. It suggests that we need to start by changing the way we talk about these issues. Instead of focusing on who's to blame, we need to focus on finding solutions.
So less finger pointing and more problem solving.
Precisely. It also suggests that we need to encourage open dialogue and debate, even about difficult or sensitive topics. We can't just shut down conversations that make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, that just leads to more division and misunderstanding. We need to learn how to disagree respectfully and see things from different perspectives.
Exactly. And that's where critical thinking comes in. If people are able to think critically, they're less likely to be swayed by emotional appeals or manipulative rhetoric.
It's about giving people the tools to see through the noise and form their own informed opinions.
Precisely. And the book argues that this is essential for creating a more just equitable and productive society.
Wow, this is a lot to unpack. It feels like we've barely scratched the surface of this book. There's so much to consider. But I think we've given our listeners a good foundation to start with. What are your final thoughts before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
I think the key takeaway from this part is that there are alternative approaches to education that might better serve all students, especially boys. It's not about turning back the clock or erasing progress. It's about finding a balance that honors the needs and strengths of both genders. And I think the book does an excellent job of laying out the challenges and potential solutions.
I agree. It's a call to action, urging us to rethink the way we approach education and to create a system that truly prepares students for the complexities of the real world. And for those of you who want to delve deeper into this topic, I highly recommend checking out this book. We'll provide links to where you can find it in the show notes.
It's a thought-provoking read that will challenge your assumptions and leave you with a deeper understanding of the forces shaping our world.
And that's what the deep dive is all about. We'll see you next time for the final part of this deep dive, where we'll explore some more of the book's insights and discuss what we can do to create a more balanced and effective education system for all. All right, so welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground here, from the historical shifts in education to the challenges the boys face in the current system. And we even explored some promising alternative approaches. But there's one more piece of the puzzle that we need to examine, and that's this whole idea of victimhood culture and its broader societal impact.
Yeah, this is where the book really gets into some thought-provoking territory. It argues that this pervasive focus on victimhood, while often well-intentioned, can have some unintended consequences that reach far beyond the classroom.
Okay, so we talked about how this victimhood mentality might be affecting boys in school, but how does it play out in the larger society?
Well, the book suggests that it contributes to a sense of entitlement, a decline in personal responsibility, and a tendency to blame others for one's problems. And it argues that you can see this mindset in everything, from the increase in lawsuits and the rise of cancel culture to the polarization of political discourse.
So instead of focusing on solving problems, we get caught up in assigning blame and seeking retribution.
That's one way to put it. The book argues that this focus on victimhood can create a culture of fear and resentment, where people are quick to take offense and slow to forgive.
And that doesn't really sound like a recipe for a healthy or productive society.
Not at all. The book suggests that we need to shift away from this victimhood mentality and move towards a culture of personal responsibility, resilience, and accountability.
That sounds great in theory, but how do we actually make that shift? It feels like this victimhood mentality has become so ingrained in our culture.
It's definitely a complex challenge, but the book does offer some practical suggestions. It starts by emphasizing the importance of changing the way we talk about these issues. Instead of focusing on who's to blame, we need to focus on finding solutions.
So, less finger pointing, more problem solving.
Precisely. It also suggests that we need to encourage open dialogue and debate even about difficult or sensitive topics. We can't just shut down conversations that make us uncomfortable.
Yeah, shutting down conversations or silencing opposing viewpoints just leads to more division and misunderstanding.
Exactly. It's about learning to disagree respectfully, to see things from different perspectives, and to engage in constructive dialogue, even when it's uncomfortable.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do we make sure that those conversations are productive and not just shouting matches?
Well, that's where critical thinking comes in. The book really emphasizes the importance of teaching critical thinking skills so people can, analyze information, evaluate evidence, and form their own informed opinion.
So it's about giving people the tools to navigate the complexities of the world and make up their own minds, rather than just blindly accepting what they're told.
Exactly. And this applies to everything, from personal relationships and career choices to political beliefs and social issues.
This is all really resonating with me. It feels like we've come full circle. Back to the importance of education, but not just any kind of education. An education that empowers individuals to think critically to take responsibility for their actions and engage in meaningful dialogue.
That's a great way to put it. And I think that's the book's ultimate message. It's a call to action for all of us to re-examine our assumptions, to engage in open and honest conversations, and work towards creating a more balanced and equitable society.
Well, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about. This book really is a deep dive into some complex and challenging issues, but it also offers a glimmer of hope, suggesting that positive change is possible if we're willing to have those tough conversations and make a conscious effort to shift our perspective.
I agree. It's not about pointing fingers or dwelling on the problems. It's about acknowledging the challenges and working together to find solutions.
For those of you who want to delve deeper into these ideas, I highly recommend checking out this book. You can find it on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
It's an eye-opening read that will challenge your assumptions and give you a new lens through which to view the world around you.
Now, on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. We hope you found it insightful and thought-provoking. Remember, knowledge is power, and by understanding the forces shaping our world, we can become more informed and empowered individuals. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll see you next time.